Hello, I'm Professor Martin Harry. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the JDP Music Building here in Oxford, and also to our Speaks audience across the world tuning in for this talk. We've been absolutely thrilled to have Anna Clyne with us this week, working not only on her new project, connected with the concept of the augmented orchestra, which I believe she and Jodie Elf will talk about in this talk, but also with a concert of student works and her own works that will be taking place this evening. So her talk will be, broadly speaking, an introduction to some of the themes of the concert that you'll find, as well as her research that will be realized in the summer as part of the cultural program here in Oxford. It gives me great pleasure to welcome first Anna Clyne. Thank you.
Thank you. It's so great to be here. We've had a fantastic week. Thank you, Professor Martin Harris, and for Ensemble ISIS, led by Professor John Trail, our fearless conductor on works of mine and 6 fantastic composers here at Oxford University. So it's a bit full circle being here this evening. I grew up in Abingdon. I then went to Edinburgh University to study my undergrad in music. I then hopped across the pond, went to New York, where I did my master's at Manhattan School of Music, and I still live in America. So I am officially British-American composer. But I'm thrilled this evening we're going to have 3 quite different pieces of mine. The first is a piece called October Rose. It's a piece for 2 violins. The second piece is a piece called Red Nines. It's a piece for solo piano. And the last work of mine is a piece called Fractured Time, which is a piece for sinfonietta, so string quartet and one of each of the woodwinds and one of each of the brass and piano. So 3 quite different works from 3 quite different phases of my musical journey. So I thought I would start by sharing some inspirations and other pieces that relate to those pieces that you will hear this evening. So the first piece I mentioned is a violin duet, October Rose. And this is actually a piece that is part of a suite of 7 pieces called The Violin. And the origin of that suite was actually here in Oxford. Back in 2008, I was on, is it Broad Street, where Oxfam is? I think that's the street, yes. And I love their basement. They have lots of CDs and vinyl, so I was flipping through, and then in the corner, I saw this dusty old violin case. And of course, was very curious. I opened it up, and there was this beautiful violin with a lion's head scroll that had been hand carved, but it was missing a bridge, it was missing strings, it had a sort of wonky bow with it. Anyway, I think it was £5.99, so like $9, so it's a bargain. So I picked it up and I took it to Oxford Violins. I was a cellist at the time, and actually I see my cello teacher from school in the audience here today. Hi, Jackie. So I was playing the cello, so I hadn't played violin yet, so I knew about Oxford Violins, where there's a wonderful violin maker and violin repairer, Bruno Guastalo. And I took in my violin and asked, how much would it cost to bring this back to life? And I think it was about £100 or so, very reasonable. But at the time I didn't have the money, so I took we had a chat. I shared that I was a composer. I took the violin back to New York, and a few weeks later I got a notice on MySpace. Now, for those of you who are a little younger, you might not, MySpace was before Facebook. And Bruno contacted me and said, you know what, I'll restore your violin in exchange for composition lessons. So I thought, well, that sounds wonderful, thank you. So I came back in the winter and I had this beautifully restored violin, which I wasn't able to play. So I went back to New York, and myself and Jodie, who is here this evening, both my collaborator and now husband, we have a dear friend called Neil and his wife Amy. They're both wonderful violinists, and Neil offered to do another creative barter of violin lessons for a violin duet for him and his wife Amy, which I thought, great, I think this is a great deal for me. So Fortunately, I had violin lessons, I learnt the violin, and I wrote this suite called The Violin, the third movement of which you will hear today is the duet October Rose. Some of the pieces on the album are for one violin, so solo, and some of them are for 5 violins. And the very last piece of the violin is called Lavender Rain. And the final piece of the puzzle is that I met a wonderful animator in New York City called Josh Dorman, who creates these beautiful stop-motion animations. And I came across his work on a TV program where he works with people with Alzheimer's, and he, in collaboration with a music therapist who accesses memories through music, he creates these beautiful canvases. So anyway, I gave him this suite, the violin, and for each of the 7 movements, he created these beautiful stop-motion animations. So you'll hear October Rose, but I'd like to show you Lavender Rain. Quick note from, I see some composers in the audience, so before I actually play it to you, a few notes about the music itself. The lowest note on the violin is a G, but at the beginning of this piece, I actually detune it by a half step, which is called scordatura, and then slowly twist the peg so you get to the low G. So, I'll use my trusted pointer. So here, the F, which is below the G of the violin, then we have this slow ascending line in the first violin. Second violin takes the ascending line all the way up to the top, and then this very slow descending motif. This section repeats, and then we have a descending line, which takes us to the scale at the end, takes us back down to G, the actual lowest note of the violin. So a 2-page piece of music with an ascending line and a descending line. So it's my pleasure to play for you now Lavender Rain, the last movement of the violin, with animation by Josh Dorman, and performing on this recording our dear friends Neil and Amy. Thank you. Thank you. So I had the joy of having lunch with some of the Masters composers today. And one of the things we chatted about is digging into our back pockets to find material when we're in a pinch and when we need a deadline. So I was in that position. A few years after this, I was writing a piece for the Houston Ballet, a full-length ballet, and the choreographer actually really loved that piece of music, so I reorchestrated it, which is a wonderful exercise as a composer to take an existing piece, like a piano piece, or in this case, a piece of 5 violins, and reimagine it through the orchestration. And that's one of the reasons I love writing for the orchestra, which is a major part of my work at the moment. So I thought I'd show you just a 1-minute excerpt of a rehearsal, actually, of the Houston Ballet. So it's the same piece of music you just heard, but arranged for orchestra. So yeah, it's what started with a dusty violin in Oxfam ended up in Houston, rearranged for the Houston Ballet. The next piece on the program of mine this evening, I'm delighted that Antoinette is going to be performing a piece called Red Nines. And Red Nines is a piece for solo piano. It is actually the most recent piece of mine this evening. It's written for another dear friend of ours called Alex Pay, who lives in our town of New Paltz, which is about 90 minutes north of New York City, a dear friend and a wonderful pianist. And in a way, it was a preparatory exercise for a piano concerto. And so I thought, you'll hear the piece, but that led to the piece called Atlas. Art is often a big inspiration for my music, and my piano concerto Atlas is inspired by the German artist Gerhard Richter. And so he has a collection of 4 volumes of his sketches, actually it's over 5,000 images of photographs, architectural drawings, paintings, and sketches in this 4-volume series called Atlas. And there is the front cover. My husband Jody is also a big fan of Gerhard Richter, and for Christmas I thought it'd be great to get him this, what I thought was about this big 4-volume set. It arrived from Germany, and in fact it's probably bigger than our coffee table, so you have to imagine this book is pretty much almost that size. But so I thought I'd play you a little excerpt of the second movement. So the music is in 4 volumes that corresponds to the 4 volumes of the book. So here we have, the second volume. So you have some architectural drawings, some of his photographs, some sketches, and here you start to see the introduction of color. And here, very much moving towards what we think of, for those of you who are familiar with his work, he often has layers of paint, so you get these sort of swashes of color, but it's really fascinating to see his very realistic paintings as well. I mean, so he's a really incredible artist. So thinking about how to translate that layering into music, in a way, I did it with the orchestration of the excerpt you heard of Lavender Rain. So taking a line and then expanding it through the orchestration. So I'll show you the first page of the music, and then we'll listen to an excerpt. So I shall point up here. So here is the piano, solo piano line. We have the cellos playing a low line against it. But what I start to do is when the piano, it's a sort of a loop, which goes until here, then it comes back again, adding in, a few more lines. And with each repetition, gradually adding other instruments. It doesn't matter what they are, woodwinds, brass, with each repetition doubling. So that's one of the fun things about orchestra. It's like painting. So you could have a piano playing a line, but then put the flute on the upper octave, the bassoon on the lower octave, and that's something that I really love to do. So the second movement is very quiet. Not all of my music is quiet, as you'll hear this evening with Fractured Time, but I'll play you a short excerpt of the second movement of Atlas, performed live actually at the Bravo Vale Festival in Colorado. So it's outside, so you'll get a few birdsong moments that are just serendipitous. So this is the second movement of Atlas. Thank you. Thank you for composers, Tierce de Picardy. I never can pronounce that quite correctly, but the Picardy third, I love that when a piece is in a minor key and then at the very end you get that major third, and it just, I overuse it, but I do love it. But anyway, that was Fabio Luisi conducting the Dallas Symphony Orchestra with soloist Jeremy Denk, who is also a very good friend of Alex, for whom I wrote Red Nines, the piece that you'll hear Antoinette performing this evening. So the third piece of mine this evening is called Fractured Time, and I think this is most representative of my orchestral writing. And one of the things I love about the orchestra is such a contrast of colors that you can play with. I mean, you could have a melody harmonized and actually you could have just a unison melody that sounds completely different with each iteration, with different combinations of instruments. But I love that sort of that contrast, basically. And the piece Fractured Time this evening, it was written during the pandemic, and it's that experience of time that we all shared, that both simultaneously compressed and expanded, and it was kind of a bit of a whirlwind and took us to our extremes in many ways. So that piece will definitely do that. But as you get a glimpse this evening, art really informs a lot of my music, both other people's art and also myself creating my own art as part of the process. But I'd like to talk a little bit about a piece called Abstractions, which is an orchestra piece. Here we go. An orchestra piece in 5 movements, and it responds to 5 different pieces of contemporary art. Just to show you some examples of these, the first is by Sarah van der Beek. It's a piece called Marble Moon. She's a wonderful artist based in Baltimore in the US. The second movement is inspired by Hiroshi Sugimoto. This is a photograph of the Caribbean Sea, and I love that stillness that he creates. The third of the 5 movements is a piece called River by Ellsworth Kelly. The fourth movement is a piece called 3 by Bryce Marden. I love this one. It almost feels like the lines are dancing on the page. And the final piece, and perhaps actually my favorite painting in this piece, is by the Ethiopian-American artist Julie Moretto, and it's a piece called Auguries. And when I first looked at it, I thought, you know, it really looks like a graphic score. I could imagine giving that to musicians, and I'd be curious to see how they might improvise in response to it. So I thought, right, I want to write a 3-minute piece for this movement, so I'll take each section as, you know, 30 seconds each. And I started to trace the lines and try and translate that into music. And it sounded really awful. And I thought, you know, we don't look at art in the same way we look at music. We don't read it left to right. It's more the emotional impact of the piece. And I decided at the end, you know, something we discussed today, what do you do when you spend all this time writing something? Sometimes you just have to learn from it and let it go, or put it in your back pocket for a rainy day. But I decided I wanted to evoke the emotional impact of this piece. Especially knowing her concept of this piece of art was the idea of a structure on the brink of collapse, of something that's really getting fractured, something that has a lot of energy, like those very sort of dense shifting forms. So I love, as a former cellist, I love writing for strings. So I imagine this sort of cascade figure in the violins that then gets passed around the orchestra. And as you saw when we watched that video of Atlas, you can really play with spatialization of the orchestra because the strings are like violin 1, violin 2, viola, cello, and the basses. So you can actually have figures visually and sonically move around the ensemble. So I'm going to play you Auguries, which is the movement that is inspired by this wonderful painting. A little snippet of it, but you see it has different energy to the other pieces that we heard. A little self-promo. If you want to hear the whole piece, I did just release an album called Abstractions, and it has the whole piece on it, along with some other works with Marin Alsop conducting the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra, so you can hear the whole work there. As something I had up on the screen at the very beginning was the augmented orchestra, which I'd really love to speak to you about and share with you, because this week it's been wonderful meeting the composers here and working with John and Ensemble ISIS, both for tonight's program, but also being a cultural fellow at the new Schwartzman Center for the Arts and Humanities. Myself and Jody had the opportunity to workshop a new work called Looking Glass, which features the augmented orchestra, which we'll delve into a little bit more shortly, but the most ambitious implementation of the augmented orchestra is a piece called Palette. To date is a piece called Palette. The augmented orchestra expands the sonic possibilities of the orchestra. So for example, in what we just heard, the lowest instrument was the double bass. Now with live electronic processing with the augmented orchestra, you can take the basses down an octave, so you get those subtones that you hear more in pop music. You could take a triangle, put a delay on it so it resonates long before its natural decay. So we have access to all these sounds, and Jodie's going to share some more of the magic behind these tricks in just a little bit. But I was delighted to write a piece called Palette, which is a concerto for augmented orchestra. So it's in 7 movements, and each movement features a different section of the orchestra. So sort of a next step from writing a piano concerto is a concerto for the actual orchestra. So for example, the first movement features the piano, the second movement features the woodwinds, the third the strings, and so forth. And the title is Palette, because as part of the process for this piece, I wanted to create my own artwork. So there are 7 movements that spell palette. So it's plum, amber, lava, ebony, teal, tangerine, and emerald. And for each of the movements, I created a canvas, probably so. I think it was like 30 inches by 30 inches, something like that. exploring those different hues and textures. So for lava, for example, actually getting pumice and mixing that in with the paint, so I got really interesting textures. For amber, putting resin in with the paint, so you get this sort of that sort of shiny veneer. So I'll start by showing the paintings, and then we can look at some music. So here are some of the paintings. This is plum, and amber, lava. This is the one with the pumice. The pumice. Ebony, teal, tangerine, and finally this is also my screensaver. Actually works well as a screensaver, but that's emerald. So before we dig into the electronics, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the piece. It was premiered with Stefan Deneuve and St. Louis Symphony, but actually this was co-commissioned between 6 orchestras, and the video is with the New World Symphony Orchestra, where we also collaborated with Luc Kritzek, a wonderful lighting designer. He's worked with Cirque du Soleil and various other performances, so he lit each of the 7 movements, so the orchestra and the audience were engulfed in these swashes of color that corresponded to the different paintings, and the paintings were also projected above the orchestra, so the idea is you're really jumping into these paintings. So I should play you it's like about 2.5 minutes, but it gives you a little snippet of each of the 7 movements, and after that I'd be delighted to introduce you to Jody, who will talk about the electronic part of Palette. So here's your quick guide through Palette. So there you get a little whistle-stop tour of Palette. So as I mentioned, it's a concerto for augmented orchestra. And now the augmented orchestra is going to be featured in Looking Glass, the piece that we were workshopping that will be here in June. So June 24th, if you're here, you'll get to hear the augmented orchestra in person. But it's my great delight to introduce my collaborator, who actually recorded the violin 20 years ago. We've collaborated on many projects over the years, including most recently a marriage. And Jody is the wizard behind the augmented orchestra. So, Jody, over to you.
Thank you. Hi. As we were looking at the Palette video, I realized that I had excerpted a couple of examples of the augmented orchestra from Palette and completely forgot to include them in the presentation, so we'll just move on from that. Do you want to say anything about the score for Palette? Okay, so just real quickly, I'll just jump ahead. Well, let me see. A little bit about the augmented orchestra background, because that'll give context. So this whole thing came out of a conversation that Anna and I had 7, 8 years ago about the fact that I work a lot for the past 30 years or so in the world of television broadcast, recording studios, sound design, and with a lot of audio technology processing for music specifically. And you know, we have all these incredible tools that do incredible things for audio, and with the advent of increasingly powerful computers, they can do them in real time. And it's this whole world of sonic possibility that's really emerged and developed into a massive global industry since the advent of recording technology in the beginning of the 20th century, right? And Anna has spent her entire career working with orchestras who basically follow a model that hasn't changed in about 300 years, right? The orchestra is still stuck in its basic acoustic format. Shouldn't say stuck, it's a beautiful thing, but it hasn't, you know, moved completely successfully into the world of modern audio technology. And so the augmented orchestra was an attempt to bring these two worlds together a little bit, because a lot of attempts to integrate electronics into an orchestral scene end up requiring the conductor to be listening to a click track for synchronization purposes, which really is like putting a pair of handcuffs on an orchestra, and it prevents them from being as expressive as it can be. And so what we wanted to do is try to find a way to integrate this technology with the orchestral form while respecting the orchestra as the music-making entity that it is. And that's been critical to our process through this whole thing. So as we've come along, I'll show you some examples of the technology in a second, but as we've come along, we've started to integrate the performance of the augmentation into the score itself. And our goal has always been that we can develop this to the point where it can be sent out in the world without somebody like myself to travel with it for technical support, because Anna's pieces get performed a lot, and I couldn't possibly be in all the places that the pieces may be performed. If they're successful, we hope so. And so along the way, we've been developing this process of creating a methodology that somebody from the orchestra can execute these reasonably sophisticated audio processes in real time. And we've gotten to the point where, for Palette anyway, we integrated an actual staff into the orchestral score itself, and there's a player in the orchestra who gets a part that they follow along with. That's basically a very simple keyboard part that they follow along on a MIDI keyboard. Now with Palette, I was personally responsible for executing everything. And so the initial implementation of the score was just simply a black bar that the conductor would see to indicate that there is a process going on at that point in the score. And I can show you like that, for instance. So for these bars, the piano is enjoying some pitch shift. The English horn starts at that point, pitch shift and a little reverb, so on and so forth. One of the exciting things about Looking Glass that we've done is we've actually gotten to the point where we've handed off that performance to somebody in the ensemble, and they're playing along on a very simple MIDI keyboard, and that actually worked really well. So it's really exciting to be here doing this workshop. That's one of our big aspirations for the outcome of this workshop, is to be able to actually achieve that for the first time. And I'll go back and retrospectively include that with Palette and the other two pieces we've done with Augmented Orchestra. So now, the Augmented Orchestra technically leaves the orchestra as the orchestra, does not require the players to change their performance style or to attach anything to their instruments, pickups, or anything else. But it's just, they just have to execute the score as it's written on the page, as if they were playing a Brahms or a symphony or something. And what we do is we place some microphones around the orchestra on specific instruments, and it can change from piece to piece. So far, typically, we do about 8 instruments just in the interest of economy. It could be many more. Maybe in the future it will be. But for instance, we might have a mic on a flute or on an oboe or a bassoon or some of the brass instruments, or in the piano in the case of Palette, or on the double basses. And then throughout the course of the piece, those microphones get turned on or off at very specific times, as indicated in the score. And when it's turned on, a whole set of processes can happen to that mic at that moment. And it may only stay on for 2 bars, or 1 note. In the case, Anna mentioned the triangle at one moment in Palette, and we had that triangle just, you know, played that 1 note, and it's suspended over many bars into the rest of the piece, long beyond what it would naturally sound as. And so the beauty of it is that we can be really specific about what we're applying processes to. It's not just a general wash over the orchestra of things. So I actually created a couple of quick examples excerpted from Looking Glass, this piece that we're working on here, just to give you a couple of quick little sound bites. So what you'll hear first here is a harp played as the harp would be played acoustically. It's a really short little clip. Okay? And so the next what you'll hear is now the harp augmented with an added low octave and some sustain beyond it. Okay? So it's exactly the same harp, exactly the same performance, but it turns into a sound that a harp would never make on its own. And so we're exploring this throughout the orchestra, and it can be done in real time. Here's a couple more quick examples. Here's a woodwind gesture in its natural state. And then here's exactly the same phrase, but augmented with a distortion, like an electric guitar's distortion. And then in this case, I also created an example of what that sounds like in the context of the orchestra. And our goal is always that nothing is amplified, per se. We're not doing this to make anything louder. We're just turning these things on and off to create texture in the orchestra. The overall volume of the performance is determined by the unamplified acoustic orchestra. And so we tuck the augmentation right into that. And we've had examples where people who have come to see these performances say, I'm not sure that I heard the augmentation because it's so sort of integrated with the orchestra. And because nothing is pre-recorded and nothing is looped and played back, all of the sounds are generated by those instruments and that player in that hall at that moment. And so the harmonic integration is really seamless with the processing, as opposed to creating a sound of a distorted woodwind line that plays along with the woodwinds. It always sounds sort of separated or adjacent to the orchestra as opposed to being part of the orchestra itself. So there's one more quick example. Here's, again, back to the harp in its natural state. And then we've got the same exact phrase augmented in both higher and lower octaves. Now you could say, well, why not just have two harps and have them play two different octaves, right? You could do that. And you would get some of the same experience of the middle and higher octave, possibly. But there's always a question of resources, available resources. You may not have 3 harpists in your town, right? And then the other side of it, too, is that the low octave probably extends below the lowest string of the harp naturally, and it would never have, if you've ever sat next to a harp, it's a beautiful sounding instrument, but the low end of the harp doesn't have a whole lot of projection power, right? It's a great sound that is not often heard beyond the orchestra. This gives us the ability to play with that quality of sound, but actually bring it into the forefront a little bit. And so here again is that same example, but in context of the orchestra. So it's like a contrabass harp or something. Anyway, this is the 4th piece that we've done this way with augmented orchestra, and each one we do, we get a little more bold with the processes. We've been more successful with the integration, and the biggest challenge is sometimes how very little rehearsal time we get with these pieces, because orchestras are big, complicated things to manage, and we don't have the luxury, as we do here with in Oxford, to take the time to really just experiment with stuff. So it's been a great luxury to be here with these ensembles, and we really appreciate their collaborative nature as we play around with these sounds and make this process a little more viable to go out in the world. So just a couple more quick slides. The augmented orchestra, all of this control system is built in a program called Max MSP. And to call Max MSP a program isn't really accurate. It's more like a graphical programming language for music, audio, video, and MIDI, and images. These days started out years ago as just a database system that came out of an institute in France called IRCAM and has continued to evolve over the years. And here's an example of the main control page for Looking Glass as it is now. It's needs a little tidying up, but basically what I see here, these are all audio meters, and as audio is playing from the orchestra, this represents the various microphone inputs. I'll see signal there as they come and go. And then each one of these little boxes here, this represents movement 1, movement 2, movement 3. Each one of these you could think of as a computer subroutine. And so each one of those little boxes contains a set of instructions, if you will, that's mapped to one of the keys on the keyboard. And so when someone plays a particular G in a particular octave in movement 1, it would open up the routines that are in that little box, and it may slowly fade up the microphone, apply a set of parameters and processing to it, hold until the key is released, and then fade out quickly or slowly, depending on what's happening with the score. And that can be different for every single one of those movements throughout the piece. And it allows us to really craft the augmentation to really suit the score. And it's really, it's not an easy thing to do as we've gotten into it. It requires a lot of attention to detail as we get as the scores evolve and as we get more and more into the sonic world, because if you've got a conductor, again, we want to respect the orchestra as the expressive entity it is, and if we have a conductor that does a hard cutoff, you can't have a processing lingering because it just hasn't finished decaying yet. And so from every one of these cues has to behave according to the way the score is written. And so it's very, very customized in that way. And here's a little bit of examples inside what one of those little subroutines would look like. That's the very first gesture from the harp, and there's a frequency shifter, the pitch shifter, a long reverb, fade-ins, fade-outs, times, parameters, and so on and so forth. Down in movement 2, that's another harp gesture. That's the one you heard that shifts up and down simultaneously. And then the way Max works, sort of briefly, is that you have an object, and an object may represent an audio input, like the harp input there. And I can route that, I can send that around inside the software moment by moment. And then these are all just little, numeric definitions of how things should behave. And so each one of the parameters at each moment in the piece gets an address, and then is crafted to behave the way I decide it should behave at that moment. So it requires a lot of patience and building time, but once it's done, it's fixed, and then that gesture will always respond in the same way at that moment in the score, and it can be executed as simply as by hitting a G for 2 whole notes or something like that. And so one of the exciting things, like I mentioned, we've done here at Oxford over the past through this residency the past week, is that we've now actually transformed from those blocks of suspended processes in the score to actually having notes in the score now. And you'll see there's a live electronics part there, and the harp processing is simply indicated by that C at that octave on the bass clef as if it were a piano part. And I expanded one out here somewhere. There you go. And so that's that same gesture there. And the person performing the part doesn't need to know anything about electronics or anything about audio engineering. All they need to know is they need to play that note at that point in the score, and the processing will happen, assuming they've got the mics plugged in properly. But we're trying to make it so that it's not technically intimidating or expensive to execute, so that orchestras can embrace this without feeling like they have to generate a huge rental budget for a PA system or a lot of labor to install things that are complicated, or to fly someone like myself from New York to manage it. So hopefully we can get it to the point where it can just be a little application that gets emailed along with the score to the orchestra that's going to perform it, and then they can do it on their own. So, and here's one more quick example where we've got processes overlaying. So we're, one note from the previous page is suspending here. I don't remember exactly what that is, but a different note is added for the flute at that point. They coexist, and then another note is added here at the end, where this note ends at the end of that bar. That whole note times out at the end of that bar. That suspends across several bars there, and then we get a new introduction of a process at that point. So it allows a lot of dovetailing and crossfading and so on and so forth that can happen at any tempo that the conductor takes it. You just play along faster or slower, or as the orchestra expresses itself. And that's basically the augmented orchestra in a nutshell. And we're excited to keep pushing it down the road. So, and if you want to read a little bit more about it, you can go to theaugmentedorchestra.com. Do you want to say anything else?
Sure, thanks. I think you covered it all. But yeah, it's been a wonderful collaboration, and as Jodie was saying, it's been amazing to have this opportunity to workshop this material. So I hope you can join us for Looking Glass. A few words about the piece, actually, Looking Glass, because it all loops back, as you know, composers to the concept that really birthed the idea. So Looking Glass being here in Oxford, looking at how sound refracts and reflects, and to create Alice's imaginary world. So that piece is for actually string quartet with chamber ensemble. And the idea is that we have the string quartet, which is totally acoustic, no augmentation. Then we have the ensemble, which is an acoustic augmentation of the quartet, and then the live electronics is a extension of the acoustic augmentation. So anyway, June 24th, we hope you can join us. But we do have 15 more minutes, so if you have any questions for us, we'd be delighted to answer them.
Thanks. No questions? Okay. Yes.
I love this project. Thank you both so much for the talk. But my question was, it's really nice how, let's say, idiomatic the processes that you're doing are in relation to the orchestra. So it's something that it's not so jarring that it really sounds like it's of the orchestra. Can you tell us a little bit about your ideas behind the kinds of processing you're applying compositionally?
Yeah, in terms of the kinds of processes, first of all, and we're really grateful for that, because the whole idea is it's really integrated. But the way our creative process has evolved, it's sort of changed from piece to piece. So, for example, in Palette, The Gorgeous Nothings was the first one. Our first big AO piece was a piece called The Gorgeous Nothings for 7 singers and orchestra. And the first movement there was a vibraphone, like 2 octaves, and I played the MIDI to Jodie, and we were just brainstorming ideas of things that we could do with it. And over to you. What was
and the vibraphone, if you're familiar, is a sort of metallic mallet-based instrument, and so Anna had written these chords that were beautiful chords, but when we take those and move them down an octave, suddenly they sound like Tibetan bells or something. It's a sound that you wouldn't hear in the orchestra, and it's a sound that, if you were to find a bell that sounded like that naturally, the nature of that bell wouldn't allow you to play a chord in that way, right? You run up against the limitations of physics. Like if you need a piece of metal to resonate that lowly, that deeply, you wouldn't be able to play a 4-note chord with it. And so again, this is a sort of a beautiful example of what we can do with the augmented orchestra, is explore sonorities or borrow sonorities from different sort of cultural suggestions, and then stick them into the orchestra and make it happen in real time. And so, it's, again, like when Anna mentioned before about the taking a bass and shifting it down an octave too, that explores territory that we're all completely familiar with from the world of pop music in the 21st century, right? There's a very familiar sound to us, but we never hear it at the orchestra hall, right? And sometimes somebody said something about, maybe a palette review said something about, well, rather than do that with the basses, why not just, write an organ part? Right? Something like that, right? And sure, I acknowledge that, but most concert halls don't have a giant organ with the 32-foot stops, So should that then, by extension, mean that you never get to explore those sounds in the orchestra just because it's not a physical option? Well, I think there's an option now, So for me, it's a lot of work, the programming, and it's really frustrating when things don't work right, and it takes a lot of time to refine it, whatever, but it really feels like a huge sonic playground. And I still feel like, even though these pieces get more and more ambitious, I still feel like we're really just scratching the surface of how much we can explore, given the very wide range of dynamics and sound qualities that the orchestra has already. And where can we go with it? It's a great question.
Yeah. As a composer, it's great to have access to all these new sonorities, to be able to imagine that. And that example with this piece, The Gorgeous Nothings, with the vibraphone, we had a conversation early on so as I was writing the piece, I was able to have that sonority of the pitch-shifted vibraphone in the piece and bring it back, because I think that's our challenge as a composer, is structure and how to have gestures that bind the work. So it's been really interesting as the creative process, and which is evolving from piece to piece as to how we imagine the combination of the electronics with the live instruments.
Yeah. And the reality is that the world of processing capabilities that are available to us now is enormously vast, right? And it's frustrating that when Anna's writing a piece, she doesn't have access to all of the possibilities to imagine while she's writing the piece. It's something we've actually struggled with, is like, can I make some kind of little real-time model that she could work with as she's, putting notes on paper to see what this might sound like or that might sound like or whatever. And it continues to be a challenge. We haven't found an elegant way to do it, mostly because Anna works with a notation program called Sibelius. And Sibelius is a fantastic notation program, and it's a really rudimentary audio program. It won't do much in terms of allowing us to take just the flute line and route it out through a process from Sibelius. And so it's a 2 or 3 step transformation process to go from the score software to then outputting to something that we can play with as an audio file that we can then process in various ways, and then seeing if it works or not, and then I have to implement it in the performance software and so on and so forth. So it's a labor of love, but but it's fun to see it evolving. So.
I see lots of composers here. I was wondering if you have any questions. Yes?
I'm just wondering, if you're changing the sounds of the orchestra, why have you made the decision not to allow yourself to amplify some things and perhaps take it to the next level and become even more extreme in some of the sounds?
Yeah, I think the goal of the augmented orchestra is to really have it integrated. So the idea is that when you're hearing those low tones, you're almost not aware of the source. But it's a good question, because on your piece this evening with the electric violin, it's definitely a sonority that you're playing with. So there's no right or wrong way. It's just, I think the augmented orchestra, the idea is it's really an organic extension where you can't really perceive where the acoustic orchestra stops and the electronics begin. What's your perspective?
Yeah, I just want to say I have no philosophical objection to amplification. I spent 2 months last year on tour with a band called 9 Inch Nails. And so if you're familiar with that work, you know that they are very, very amplified. And so I don't mind that at all. But for me, it's 2 things. First and foremost, the sonorities, and secondly, we're moving very delicately into, for lack of a better term, sort of sacred territory, right? The orchestra is perceived by critical listeners as such a sort of precious thing, right? And the idea in many cases of introducing any kind of technology to the orchestra is forbidden. Why would you do that? It's a great thing. It's always been a great thing for hundreds of years. It's worked. Why mess with it, right? And I believe that there's a lot of reason to try to mess with it because we keep evolving, and compositional styles keep evolving, and audio processing and technology keeps evolving, and so on and so forth. But if we're going to get those orchestral purists on our side, that allows us to go further with it, you got to do so very gently and respectfully, And this is a way to sort of invite them into the idea that there can be a safe space for this kind of processing to happen compositionally, and so on and so forth. I don't have any problem with the idea of amplifying something down the road if we want to at some point. All the tools are there to do it in a very simple way. It's not hard to do, but it's also fun to place restrictions on yourself. And say, we're going to work within these parameters, and how can we make it really special, given that that's our baseline with the orchestra.
Yeah. Actually, a quick note about that is in these pieces we just have 8 instruments that are augmented, and that's a very practical consideration, because it means it can go out with an 8-channel audio interface, so it's more practical to have it go out in the world. It's also compositionally great to have, as you know, restrictions. So, okay, I'm just working with these 8 instruments, but in the case of Looking Glass, we've chosen 8 very different instruments. So we have just the double bass, actually, from the strings, but then one of each of the woodwinds and 3 brass. So there's different qualities of sound to play with.
Another aspect of it, too, is purely economic. Because if you're going to start amplifying things, that means, in some cases, it means that you need to support with a PA system that's more sophisticated, maybe more expensive than orchestras may want to spend money on, and probably also the labor that comes along with installing the PA system and operating the PA system and so on and so forth. And those are skills that, may not exist within the administrative structure of most orchestras. And so we're trying to build this in a way that can really fit into, sure, you go into Lincoln Center and play with the New York Phil, you can have all the resources in the world you want to play with. But if the South Kenosha Symphony wants to try to play one of these pieces, they should have the option to do it too, without having to bend over backwards or do a special fundraising campaign to pull it off. So.
We have time for one more question, if there's any more questions. No? Yeah.
Forgive me for my naivety. But in the animation, what I really liked was the movement and the music, moves. Whilst later when you showed us some of your abstractions, my sense is that they were solidly there. Yeah? So I was wondering whether the two of you are also looking at introducing, maybe it would be light, but the visuals integrated into what you're already doing, because otherwise the art looks a bit static.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really interesting observation, because Lavender Rain with the animation, that's Josh responding to the music in a really sensitive way. The difference with Palette is it's art for the service of the creative process. So as a composer, I found it helpful to create these gestures and then translate those into music. So it's sort of the other way round. But as you are absolutely right, it gives a different effect. But I'm very visual as a composer, and actually our next, we call it AO, it's just easier than augmented orchestra. The next AO piece is a piece called Twisting Light, which is going to be a 30-minute augmented orchestra piece that explores how light, gravity, and mass is observed in black holes, and that's a very visual project to explore. So even though we're just thinking right now about the orchestra and the live electronics, I hope it's also something we can explore, some visual, maybe animation, or some kind of world that's more alive in the way that the animation was. Thank you so much for having us, and you're in for a treat with Ensemble ISIS, so I think we have half an hour to grab a tea or coffee or refreshment, and if you have any other questions, please come and say hello. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, did you want to? No, you're good.